A night like any other. It began quietly, the way tragedies often do. A small military apartment in Jacksonville, filled with simple routines and young family dreams. Tina Hines was 20, 4 months pregnant and already glowing with plans for the future. Her husband, Jeremy, kissed her goodbye as he headed to overnight duty at the naval base, something they'd done dozens of times before. Nothing unusual, no unease, just another shift, another night to get through. Inside their home, Tina straightened up, maybe thought about baby names again, maybe felt those first flutter-like reminders that life was growing. Her husband would be home soon. In a few hours, everything would be normal again. In the living room, Jeremy's teenage brother slept on the couch. Young, tired, trying to get his footing in a new city. Tina never hesitated to help family. She made space for people, even when it meant less space for herself. The night felt safe, comfortable, predictable. But someone else knew Jeremy wouldn't be home. Someone who had been close enough to notice their routines, trusted enough to be welcomed in, familiar enough to never raise suspicion. And while Tina settled into bed, a new life growing inside her, a future waiting, another kind of plan was taking shape somewhere in the dark. A plan born out of something twisted, a plan she could never have seen coming. By morning, that little apartment, once filled with young love, hopes and quiet domestic routines, would be a crime scene that shook everyone who stepped inside and haunt those closest to her for the rest of their lives. Because evil wasn't lurking outside that night. It was already in their world, just waiting for the right moment to step through the door. Just before dawn, the kind of silence that only exists in military housing hung heavy. Not peaceful, just still. The kind of quiet that makes time feel suspended, unaware of what's coming. Sometime in those dark, early hours, a familiar presence crossed the threshold. No forced entry, no shattered glass, no signs of panic, at least not at first. This wasn't someone breaking in, this was someone who already belonged in their orbit. And in the bedroom where Tina slept, the same room where she whispered dreams to her unborn child, that quiet world broke apart. What happened next wasn't a moment of panic or impulse. It was deliberate, calculated, driven by a rage so personal it leaves no doubt. This attacker knew her. Tina was sexually assaulted in her own bed, the place meant to be safest. Then the knife came down, again and again. 27 stab wounds, each one a violent sentence written against everything she was and everything she was about to become. And then the fire. Not one flame, but several. Small fires planted throughout the apartment. Not to destroy a home, but to erase a crime. Erase a life. Erase the truth. Smoke filled the air. Alarms shrieked. In the living room, Jeremy's teenage brother jolted awake to a world already on fire, confused, disoriented, fighting flames with his bare hands, trying to stop the apartment, and whatever nightmare was hidden inside it, from spreading. He had no idea what waited in that bedroom. No clue that a life had already been extinguished only feet away. When he finally walked down that hallway, nothing could prepare him for what he saw. Tina, lifeless, a future erased, hope cut down before it ever had a chance to breathe. He called 911, voice shaking, mind spinning, trying to relay horrors he could barely process himself. And as sirens approached, the truth was already twisted into suspicion. Because when police see a violent crime with no forced entry and only one person present, questions form fast. By sunrise, The world that once felt safe and simple had become a nightmare, and the real killer had already slipped back into the sunlight, carrying a secret that would stay buried for decades. By the time the sun broke over Jacksonville, police had taped off the apartment, cameras flashed, and neighbors whispered in disbelief. A young wife, a mother-to-be, gone in a way no one could comprehend. And in the middle of it all stood a stunned 19-year-old who had just watched his world collapse. Chad Hines had dialed 911 with shaking hands. He'd put out fires, he'd screamed for help, he'd walked into a bedroom thinking he'd find his sister-in-law asleep, and instead saw a nightmare carved into reality. But shock rarely looks neat. Trauma doesn't speak clearly, and fear can look a lot like guilt to someone who doesn't know what grief sounds like. Detectives scanned the scene. No broken locks, no footprints from outside, no broken glass, no kicked-in door. Whoever came in that night wasn't a stranger forcing their way through the dark. They stood in Tina's bedroom doorway and came to the conclusion most detectives would draw first. If someone else had done this, how did they get in? And how could someone sleeping just feet away not hear a scream, not hear a struggle, not wake up until the alarms? One question turned into suspicion. Suspicion hardened into certainty. Chad's words suddenly sounded like excuses, his tears like performance. Every answer he gave felt to investigators like the wrong one, not because he was lying, but because the real truth seemed impossible to them. A pregnant woman murdered. A home untouched. Only one other person inside. In the absence of another suspect, Chad became the story. Report after report framed him as the violent brother-in-law. The only witness, the only one there. And once the narrative took shape, it held like concrete. Neighbours whispered, investigators pressed, prosecutors pushed forward. Grief turned into accusation. And a teenager who had just lost his family found himself branded a killer. 2 years later, he walked into a courtroom not as a witness to tragedy, but as the accused. And with no other suspect, no alternative theory, no way to explain how this horror happened while he slept, the verdict came, swift and devastating. Guilty. Life in prison. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause, no satisfaction. Just a heavy, tragic silence. One family buried a daughter and grandchild. Another watched a son led away in shackles. 2 lives shattered. One future stolen in a bedroom. Another behind prison bars. And somewhere out there, the real killer breathed freely, smiled freely, slept peacefully at night. Because he knew something no one else did. He had fooled them all. Prison changes a person, even the innocent ones. For years, Chad lived behind razor wire, replaying the same night over and over. Not just the horror of what he saw, but the disbelief. The silence in the courtroom when the verdict was read. The way people looked at him as if a monster had been caged. He never stopped insisting he didn't do it, but in a world built on certainty and punishment, his voice was just one more echo swallowed by concrete and steel. Time moved on outside. Families built lives, holidays came and went, neighbourhoods changed. But inside, Chad's life froze at 19. A clock stuck on the worst day he would ever live through. And then, quietly, the world shifted. Science caught up to what justice had missed. The tiny traces preserved from Tina's body, Fragments so small they were once considered useless were run again with new technology. DNA testing had evolved, sharpened, become a tool that could resurrect truth from silence. And when the results finally came back, they cracked the case wide open. It wasn't Chad. It wasn't Jeremy. It was someone else. A man whose DNA matched evidence retrieved from the most intimate parts of the crime scene. A stranger to the system. A ghost in the records. In that moment, the narrative that ruined Chad's life collapsed. The justice system that once called him a killer now had to reckon with something far more uncomfortable. They had put the wrong man behind bars. 14 years. 14 birthdays missed, seasons lost, opportunities erased. 14 years of being marked by a crime he tried to stop, not commit. And one day, after nearly a decade and a half, the same system that took his freedom opened its gates and let him walk out, a free man. No headline could undo the damage. No apology could rewind time. He stepped into sunlight, not as the person he once was, but as someone who had survived a punishment for a life he never took. Meanwhile, the DNA, that microscopic witness, sat in a database, unanswered. It held the truth, but not the name. Not yet. The real killer wasn't just alive somewhere. He was living his life, passing people on sidewalks, laughing at dinner tables, aging gently into middle age, untouched by suspicion. Justice had returned innocence to one man, but it hadn't yet found the one who deserved a cell. And for the family still mourning Tina, grief mixed with a terrifying new question. If the wrong man paid the price, then who was the monster who walked free? For a while, the case existed in two worlds, closed in paperwork but alive in doubt. Detectives knew the DNA didn't lie, but DNA without a name is just a whisper in the dark. So investigators turned to a tool that didn't exist when Tina died, forensic genealogy. Instead of searching police files, they searched family trees. Second cousins, distant relatives, branches stretching across decades until, slowly, a shape emerged. A single family line stood out, and from that branch, a name surfaced. Not random, not unfamiliar. A man who had been there all along, blending into the story like a background character no one thought to question. His name was Robert Atwater, not a stranger, not a shadow in the night, a friend, someone who stood beside Jeremy on the happiest day of his life, someone who smiled in wedding photos, the kind of smile that means trust, loyalty, friendship, someone who seemed harmless, dependable, forgettable in the way quiet, friendly people often seem. Atwater had been part of their circle, drinking coffee at the same kitchen table, sharing jokes, holding conversations about futures and families. He attended their wedding, witnessed their vows. And according to his DNA, he walked into their home months later and destroyed everything. It didn't happen because of a feud, or jealousy, or a heated argument. There was no dramatic build-up, no warning sign, just a quiet man who carried a darkness no one saw, waiting for a moment when trust would be his greatest weapon. For decades, while suspicion ruined Chad's life, Atwater lived comfortably. He aged. He worked. He spent holidays with family. He woke up each morning without consequence. A free man, walking through grocery aisles, mowing lawns, waving to neighbours. To everyone else, he was just another ordinary face in line at the bank. But in a small evidence vault, his past had been waiting. Frozen in time. Waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for truth to become undeniable. And now the truth had a name. The families didn't know it yet, but their world was about to fracture again. Because the moment investigators knocked on that quiet man's door, the past they thought they buried was about to explode back into the present. For 31 years, Robert Atwater lived like nothing had ever happened. No sudden disappearances, no nervous breakdowns, no dramatic attempt to outrun his past. He didn't flee the state. He didn't change his name. He didn't vanish into some distant city. He stayed close enough to memory, but just far enough to disappear inside a normal life. Neighbours knew him as polite, quiet, soft-spoken in that way gentle people sometimes are. The kind of man who held doors open and nodded hello in the grocery store aisle. A pleasant face you forget as soon as you look away. He worked steady jobs, went home every night, aging slowly like anyone else. Hair greying, steps softening, routines becoming simpler. He even lived with his mother for a time, caretaking, they said. A good son, a responsible man, someone you'd trust to water your plants or check your mail while you were out of town. All the while, the secret never cracked in his voice. Not once. Not a hint. No slip in conversation. No shaking hands when the past was mentioned. He carried the weight of a nightmare with a calm so complete it almost felt inhuman. And while Chad was aging behind bars, losing birthdays, losing youth, losing pieces of himself to steel bars and cinder block walls, Atwater aged in peace. Morning coffee, quiet weekends, a life uninterrupted. No one ever looked at him twice, until the day they did, when detectives came to his door. There was no dramatic outburst, no confession, no frantic denial, just a stillness. The kind that says a man already knows there is nowhere left to run. A warrant, a set of handcuffs, the slow walk into a cruiser. Not surrounded by flashing lights and shouting crowds, just the quiet click of metal around his wrists. The end of a life that had never really belonged to him in the first place. Because the truth was this: he lived free for 3 decades not because he deserved peace, but because he was patient enough to blend into the ordinary. And the world looked away long enough for him to disappear in plain sight. When word spread that Robert Atwater had been identified, the world didn't explode in outrage. There were no crowds outside the courthouse, no breaking news sirens, no dramatic headlines screaming through living rooms. It came quietly, the same way the truth had waited, the same way Atwater had lived. Tina's family heard first, and for a moment there was relief. Not victory, relief. The kind that comes from finally knowing the face behind the nightmare. But it arrived hand in hand with something much darker. This man had walked freely through decades they would never get back. He had grown older while their daughter never could. He had lived his life while she never got the chance to hold her child, to grow into her marriage, to become the woman she was meant to be. You don't celebrate news like that. You sit with it. You breathe through it. And you hurt all over again. For Chad, freedom didn't come with fireworks either. There is no switch that turns a prison sentence into a normal life. No apology that rewrites 14 stolen years. He had been branded guilty before he could shave without stumbling, before he ever got to figure out who he was. Even after his release, the world didn't instantly welcome him back. Suspicion lingers long after handcuffs come off. Whispers don't evaporate just because science catches up. And yet, he kept moving forward, not because the past disappeared, but because survival was the only path left. As for Atwater, he entered a system he avoided for a lifetime, denied everything, and waited for a trial he could no longer outrun. Not a youthful predator anymore, just an aging man facing the life sentence he deserved decades earlier. There's no version of this story where everyone walks away whole. Justice came, but late. Truth surfaced, but after too much was lost. And somewhere in the middle of it all sits the memory of Tina. Not as a crime scene, not as a headline, but as a young woman with a child on the way, a future just beginning, and a smile that should have lasted years longer than it did. The case ended, but the loss didn't. Because real justice isn't just about catching a monster, it's about all the moments that monster stole, and everything time can never return. In the end, this story isn't just about a crime solved decades later. It's about the fragile line between trust and danger, innocence and suspicion, justice and time. A young mother never met her child. A teenager lost half his life. And a quiet man hid in the open long enough to believe he never had to answer for what he'd done. Evil didn't come with a mask that night. It wore a familiar face. It shook hands, laughed at wedding toasts, and blended into photos of happier days, knowing no one was looking at him. For 31 years the truth waited, not in a confession, not in a witness, but in a fragment small enough to fit on the head of a pin, and powerful enough to shatter a lie held for decades. Justice eventually found its way home, but it arrived late, and sometimes that's the hardest part. Not that monsters exist, but that they can live right beside us, unnoticed, until science, patience, and time finally drag them into the light. If there's anything this story leaves behind, it's a reminder we rarely want. The face you trust most is the one you never expect to fear. And sometimes